Yes, good morning, everybody. I hereby open this academic ceremony in which Tonio Weidler will defend the academic thesis, The Mechanism at Hand, a goal-driven approach to modeling the human sensorimotor system. May I invite you to present a summary of your study and the conclusions of your thesis.
Thank you. Dear Prorector, dear members of the committee, dear family and friends, thank you all for coming to the defense of my thesis entitled The Mechanism at Hand. In the next 15 or so minutes, I will present to you a summary of the work that we've conducted on modeling the human sensorimotor system, and specifically the function of dexterity, the fine motor control of the human hand. But before I dive into the deeper technical details of our approach, I want to give you a philosophical motivation of our approach. Humans need to interact with the world in order to survive, be it to evade a predator or to gather food. And the human mind, the human brain, has evolved throughout all of evolution in order to support this function. It is thus just natural to assume that the brain is designed towards the very purpose of action. This might seem obvious at first. However, it has very important implications for how we study the brain in neuroscience. We can no longer regard the brain an abstract, isolated information processor, as is often done in the cognitive science. But we need to acknowledge that it is part of a larger cognitive system that also includes the body that it controls and the environment that this body is situated in. We then need to study all the cognitive processes from the perspective of this body as well as the environment and the brain as one joint system. And the theory that emphasizes the role of the body in that cognitive system is called embodied cognition. In my dissertation, we propose an embodied neuroconnectionist research program to the computational neuroscience community that builds models in order to understand the mechanisms of the brain. The first three assumptions of that research program are what I've basically just told you, that the brain, body, and the environment are part of the cognitive system, and that the individual's agency within that environment and its intentions about what it wants to achieve in the environment are driving the cognitive process. The fourth assumption is that deep neural networks are plausible models of the brain. To understand what exactly that means, let me first very quickly tell you what a deep neural network or an artificial neural network is. A deep neural network transforms a bunch of numbers that might, for instance, represent an image via multiple stages of computation in a network into another bunch of numbers that might, for instance, tell you what objects are within that image. We can use these networks as models of the brain because we can feed them raw sensory information just like the information that the human brain would get. And we can make it output motor movements that can then be issued to our body or a simulation thereof. This makes sense because both the biological brain and the deep neural network both rely on the same basic computational units, neurons, and a connection of them in a large network. In some sense, we could also say that already both the biological brain and the deep neural network partially embody the human mind because they physically implement it. The last assumption of the research program we are proposing is that if we model such a cognitive system that encompasses the brain, body, and environment, and we inspire the constituents of that system with biological data or constraints, then the mechanisms that emerge if we teach the model to achieve some function that is relevant to the human as well, these mechanisms might be more likely to be also biologically plausible. In chapter 2 of my dissertation, we introduce a software toolkit that supports research within this research program. It supports researchers to build embodied brain models. Researchers that use this toolkit and GaraPy will usually follow a workflow of 4 steps. They will first build a model of the brain or of the brain structures that they are specifically interested in. Thereafter, they select or implement a motor function that they want to study. They can then use in GaraPy to train the model on the function. And they do not need to this end understand the machine learning backend that is implemented in GaraPy themselves, but can rely on the simple-to-use API that we've developed. In the last step, they can then use this network to analyze the neurocomputations that emerged during training and potentially understand something new about the brain. In chapter 3 of the dissertation, we have taken the first 3 of these steps in order to build an embodied model of the large-scale network that controls the human hand during dexterous movements. To this end, we had first a look at existing neuroimaging studies that identified which regions of the brain partake in these functions. We can then select those regions to be part of the model. Thereafter, we've consulted cell density data that tells us how many units or how many cells there are in each of the regions in the brain. From this data, we can extrapolate how many neurons or units we want to place in the artificial neural network that models the brain. Lastly, we had a look at structural connectivity data that tells us for each pair of regions in the brain how many connections there are between them, and from that, we can synthesize whether we want to connect 2 regions in the model as well. From these data sources, we have constructed the architecture that you see in the graph here. As you can see, the model includes multiple larger cortices, like the motor cortex, the prefrontal cortex, or the posterior parietal cortex, but also their subregions, like the premotor cortex or the lateral prefrontal cortex. These are the regions that we have identified from the neuroimaging literature to be relevant for dexterous movements. You can also see that each of the subregions features multiple numbers. These are the data points that we've gotten from the cell density data. And you can see that all of the regions are somehow connected with multiple arrows. This is what we've gotten from the structural connectivity data, and it guides how the data can flow, how information can flow through the network. In its entirety, this network is a deep, hierarchical, recurrent neural network model that transforms raw sensory information and a goal description into motor commands that can be issued to a simulated body. But in order to make these movements make sense, we first needed to train the model on some relevant function. The function that we had chosen is inert object manipulation. After training, the model could achieve the behavior that you can see in the animation here. And on the right in the graph, you can see that our model actually achieved better performance at this task than a model that has no biological inspiration. And it also converges much faster towards the solution. If we place this model in the context of the embodied neuroconnectionist research program that I had introduced to you earlier, we can acknowledge that it includes all the parts of the cognitive system. A brain model, but also a body, the hand, and the environment, the physical simulation, and the cube. It has agency over the environment because it is manipulating the cube into new orientations, and it knows about internal goals because it knows into which orientation it wants to rotate that cube. It is, of course, a neural network, and all parts of the cognitive system are inspired biologically. In chapter 4 of my dissertation, we asked ourselves the question how the brain may coordinate and plan complex motor movements during dexterous tasks. To this end, we analyzed the model that I had just shown you. The beauty of the approach that we are taking in my dissertation lies in the fact that in this model, at every point in time, we know the exact activity of every single neuron in the network. This is very different to what we are getting when we are measuring actual humans, where we really only know something about a bunch of neurons at the same time at very sparse time points. Now, by collecting such data and analyzing it, we can make claims about potential mechanisms that the brain may implement because we have observed them in the model that is biologically inspired. The specific mechanism that we have observed in the model that I introduced in chapter 3 is one that puts the lateral prefrontal cortex, the LPFC, into the leading role. Here, we observe that the LPFC is building long-term plans that span entire sub-goals. These are then further chunked down and projected to the premotor cortex, which narrows them down even further and projects them to the primary motor cortex. Here, we only really see immediate movements represented. Interestingly, we could also observe that in the lateral prefrontal cortex, plans are expressed in terms of the goal, whereas at the transition to the motor regions, these representations change into ones that mostly include motor or movement-related information. Moreover, we've seen that the motor regions, but not the lateral prefrontal cortex, expresses its movements in basic building blocks that can be recombined to create more complex movements, rather than expressing every movement in the full vast space of all possible motions. In sum, my thesis has introduced and applied an embodied neuroconnectionist research program to study the sensorimotor system. In chapter 2, we have introduced a software toolkit that researchers can use in order to build their own embodied brain models. In chapter 3, we did this ourselves. We modeled the human frontoparietal and pericentral network in order to study dexterity. This model can be used by future research in order to do their own analysis, or they can be inspired by the ways in which we synthesize neuroanatomical data into the structure of a network. And in chapter 4, we've done our own analysis and revealed a new mechanism that may explain how the brain controls the hand during in-hand object manipulation via planning. This can guide the construction of hypotheses in experimental research that can then be tested in vivo. Thank you for listening, and I give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you very much for this very clear presentation. The opposition will be opened by Professor Dr. Alat Wupuk, who's a professor of human brain connectivity at this university.
Thank you, Prorector. Dear candidate, first I want to congratulate you with a wonderful thesis and wonderful work. What you did is a monumental task. There's a lot of artificial intelligence models nowadays, transformers that try to perform things in the best way possible on computers. There's the human brain that does it in its own way, and to make the connection as you did is very hard but very necessary. And I want to extend my congratulations to the promotion team for undertaking that. My question goes to the fact that you had some beautiful, what I call bottom-up constraints, regions involved, cell counts, structural connectivity, that came from microscopy and imaging and went into building the model. Now, clearly, there's a future ambition to also test the model in what I will call a top-down way, that is to gather imaging data, let's say fMRI or diffusion MRI, to test hypotheses that the model generates. My question goes into your vision now, having done this work, on how to do that, and particularly a model that controls the actual dexterity of a hand is very high-dimensional. And neuroimaging data, although it can contain a lot of voxels, could be inherently quite low-dimensional. So how do you use the imaging data to test or constrain the high-dimensional model? What's your vision on this?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments and your interesting question. This is, of course, something that we have had a lot of thoughts about throughout these years already. I think I would first like to clarify that we currently would not aim to use such data in order to guide the training of the model, right? But rather always to put constraints on its structure. Maybe some of the data to put constraints on the structure, but then rather to validate afterwards whether the kind of representations and the processes that emerged in the network are valid neurally. There's multiple ways of doing this. I would say that the bottleneck at the moment, the problem, is more to gather the data, right? So this I would be something that I would give to experts in fMRI, which I am not. But it's always tough to gather data in scanners while motor tasks are performed, right? Especially if we want, and this would be necessary, to have some visual feedback, right? So like if we put the person in a scanner and they have to manipulate a cube, then we need a camera on top of the hand and project that back to whatever the participant is currently seeing. So this is difficult. But let's say we can do this, then what we would probably first do is something called representational similarity analysis. So we can gather representations, of course, from the model very easily, but then also from the data that we are collecting via fMRI. And then we can compare whether under the same conditions, these representations are similar between the model and the brain, and from that then conclude whether the model is plausible, but maybe specifically more plausible than other models.
And would you say, that actually came up and I was going to ask you, so I find it a very good suggestion. Would you say that you presented some roles for the areas, like the prefrontal plans, and then the sensorimotor regions, the premotor regions, right, which go more towards the motor, and then the real motor actions in the motor areas. Now, if you did representational similarity analysis in each of those three, would it also then help you to assert those roles for those areas? I'm not saying that those roles are in question at all, but if you do representational similarity analysis in the motor areas for, you know, pure motor actions, wouldn't you do that with too strong a prior that that is actually what is represented there? And would you not first have to test at a higher level whether actually those are the relevant representations?
Well, I mean, so first of all, of course, like we are labeling the regions in the network, but they are not necessarily roles that we imply on the model by designing the model in a certain way, right? So they are labels, and one is called motor cortex, and then you're thinking, of course, like that should be concerned with motor tasks, right?
But you do call it that, so there is an implication.
Yeah, exactly, right? Yeah. So like it's because we are then constraining the structure, like the number of what we found in the brain. But the fact that it has the motor label is more from what other people before us have labeled that region, and then we are taking, we are mapping this, right? But of course, if we are testing the model, and we've already done this partially, right? Like we maybe look in certain regions for specific pieces of information in order to confirm whether this is in fact a role that emerged in that region, right? And we've done this partially in the motor regions as well as LPFC to see where we can really see motor-related information. And for the representational similarity analysis, you would really match then, of course, the specific brain regions and the region that you want to compare to in the brain, and see whether, in fact, the motor region in the model is the one that best correlates with the motor region in the brain, in order to assert whether there's a similarity or a match. Yeah.
Completely agree with that. So now there's one small indeterminacy there that you may run into, which is that you mentioned yourself things like afference copies in the brain, where a motor command, the copy of the motor command is actually sent to sensory areas for prediction purposes. So if representational similarity analysis points to a motor command-like representation, if you're not so firm about giving labels to your areas as you were just suggesting, how would you know it's a motor command or an afference copy? And how would this lead you to test hypothesis on your model?
I would say that in general, something like RSA is agnostic to what information is represented, right? So this will always be slightly inconclusive, right? Like we will not have a certain answer. I myself also, I acknowledge that RSA is a currently good tool in order to judge whether the model matches somewhat the brain, but I don't think it's a very good tool. There's a lot of flaws with it, like we cannot say what actually makes these things match. And this means that, of course, we can say, okay, representations are similar, but it doesn't mean that we understand why. And for this, there need to be like new methods developed in order to compare models to the brain.
All right, thank you very much. I give the word back to the prorector.
Thank you. The opposition will be continued by Professor Dr. Martin Giese, who is a professor of computational sensorimotorics at Tübingen University.
Yeah, thank you very much. Also, my congratulations for this tour de force. It's not easy to implement something like that and get it working. So I wanted to ask about some more of the theoretical background using AI for the brain in your thesis, which is elaborated there very eloquently. So one concept that I wanted to ask more about is this concept of functional plausibility. So this is this concept that basically models are only valid if they basically show a computational performance that basically is competitive with certain benchmarks in computer science, which permanently change. And in some way, this argument goes along the line that models that are not fulfilling these benchmarks are not valid models for the brain. Now you have these things like visual transformers that are even better than the brain. Even for standard deep networks, you have meanwhile benchmarks where you have superhuman performance. So in how far does this functional plausibility say anything about the brain? Even more if you take into account that many of these benchmarks completely ignore data complexity.
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments and for your question. I think this is a very relevant and interesting question. And I think that, first of all, and I think I also allude to this in my thesis somewhere, it's not like we are trying to build the best model at something, right? So the more performance doesn't mean the more functionally valid, because also the human is imperfect and we are not performing every task to full performance. And so a lot of these computational, computer science or AI benchmarks are not suitable for the kind of biologically inspired models that we are using here. I think the kind of functional validity that we are using is also still a bit of a proxy. I would much rather than compare than measure how many manipulations the cube can do. I would much rather compare the behavior to, for instance, data that is collected with humans as they wear gloves that track how their hand moves as they manipulate a cube, right? So that we are maximizing, that we are validating not against a performance benchmark that is related to task performance, but to how well does it match the human behavior. And in this regard, I also don't think that in like all these transformer models and so on that get better and better at things and like get more human-like at things, which is judged based on just their performance on, again, like benchmarks, that they are thus valid. They are functionally valid because they can do a part of a task that a human can perform, but they have zero grounding in biological structure. And therefore, I don't think there's a necessary connection that we can make. But I would also like to stress that functional validity cannot be viewed in isolation and should always be combined with then also validity on the like biological validity, right? Whether the things that emerge in the network match what's happening in the brain. And that's what Professor Ruburg also referred to, right? Like measures like RSA that we can then use to determine whether it's valid on both of these pillars. But I think I'm alluding to the importance of functional validity also because I want to stress that models that only focus on the biological validity are then lacking the other pillar, the functional part. So I think in the end, both should kind of go together.
So what is your opinion about, I mean, one, in my view, very different thing between these AI models that are now very popular in the brain is training data complexity. So do you see any way to embed this in your modeling? So basically, if you use whatever foundation model, you can do zero-shot generalization, even things humans cannot do, but you need whatever a huge computing network at Amazon to run it. So not even a university can do it, and lots of data, which is very different from the brain.
Yeah, no, I also totally agree here, right? Like our brain is much more efficient in learning, and it also, of course, has already some innate biases that can make it do things from the get-go. But I think that this is also a big challenge still to AI, and I think here it's somewhere a thing where it can get a lot of inspiration actually from neuroscience to find mechanisms, to find algorithms that are able to perform at a human level, but at the same time also be as energy efficient and as quick in learning new things without requiring such complex data. It's actually like, there's a few conferences recently where there's always a question whether you think that neuroscience is useful for AI or not, and this divides the room usually, and that's a discussion that we often have there.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. In principle, you have time for another question if you like, 1 or 2 more minutes.
Then one other question is, in some way in your analysis you make the assumption that deep neural networks used by these standard architectures are good models for brain function. Where do you see the limits of this approach if you think about real neurons and the real brain? For instance,
Oh, there's a lot of limits, right? Like there's a lot of limitations at the moment, right? Like we can, for instance, of course, all of our networks are rate-based. There's zero spiking behavior here. And I think this is something very important to actually look at the dynamics of neurons. But at the moment, to my knowledge, spiking neural networks are not able to perform to this level to really reflect functions that are motor related. So I think it's moving towards each other, right? Like as these algorithms get stronger, as the models get stronger, we can also then approach other functions. But there's also many, many more things, right? Like also one of the biggest steps I think that we have to take next is making this whole network much more recurrent and connections that are not going just in one direction of the network, but also between regions back, for instance, efference copies. These make everything much more computationally complicated, and thus we need to also work on the AI side more in order to make this work.
So do you see any specific functionality in this problem that you're investigating in terms of function that would be particular suffering from these shortcomings of the present AI rate-based models?
Maybe not so much the kind of functions. So I think one of the problems here is that we are also not thinking about plausible learning. But I think if it's about adaptation and learning and adaptation to changing conditions, then these spiking networks would be also becoming more interesting, because then we can really talk about dynamics and how they change, how the topology changes through time.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Thank you. The opposition will now be continued by Dr. Rico Mökel, who is an expert in robotics and intelligent systems from Maastricht University.
Dear candidate, I would also love to take this opportunity to congratulate you on this very nice thesis with a lot of different interesting outcomes. Given my background, I would love to ask you a couple of more technical questions as well. The first one is related to the techniques that you have been using. So the techniques that you have been using, like reinforcement learning, but also deep neural networks, are known to be very powerful techniques that allow for rich representations of data or of any kind of functions. The challenge that you then, of course, can easily run into is that you just generate black box models that do not allow you to create any deep scientific insights. But with your own thesis, you kind of like circumvented that. Can you comment a bit about what your main techniques are to make indeed like you use on one hand black box models, but on the other hand generate scientific insights, and where you feel that there are some limitations?
Esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments and for your question. I mean, of course, so there are black box models in some regards still, right? Like it's still difficult to analyze what is happening in there, although we have full access to the connectivity and the activity through time. But I think there is many methods with which we can still make assumptions. And some of those that I've used in my thesis are, for instance, principal component analysis that allows us to identify with how many variables some region might actually represent its information, right? So it can be very interesting to see whether a region that we've given a lot of space, like a lot of capacity to build its representation, indeed actually represents this information in very few key variables. And then we can run experiments that are also impossible, of course, in the human, where we would isolate some of these variables, take them out, and see what happens in the network. We've done this here in order to identify how important these variables are to the behavior, but we can also go a step further in the future and see if we take out a specific component of the representation of a region, how the behavior might change, so that we can identify what this component adds to the behavior.
Yeah, many thanks. Maybe as a follow-up question, also like from own experience, what we often see with the complex architectures that you have been creating based on the techniques that you just described, yeah, they are particularly visible also in your chapter 3, where of course lots of different blocks are being combined. A particular challenge that we keep seeing there is that because of the richness of these blocks, they easily take over functions actually of other blocks. So you desire to have a motor cortex somewhere, but because of the rich representation that you have in the individual blocks, even if you control the connections, some of these functionality just gets automatically transferred by the reinforcement learning mechanisms into other components. Did you see such kind of effects?
No.
And did you try to control or deal with such effects?
No, this is like extremely important point, I think, and you can really see this, that the not biologically inspired network that we've used as a baseline is actually 2 layers, right? And they are just huge, and they can learn all of this in these 2 layers. It takes a lot longer, but yeah. We've used multiple ablation models, right? So we've taken 3 different stages of the model, one that doesn't do any like hierarchical computation basically, and one that doesn't do the bottlenecks that we've introduced later. And you can see that in the ones that don't include these bottlenecks, where we are constantly contracting and then expanding information again, they do not learn the same mechanisms as the full model that has these contractions. So by doing some constraints on how much information can really be placed along the pathways at what point, we can also force the model, we believe, and we also think we've seen this in the analysis, we can force the model to represent certain pieces of information in specific regions. Or it's not so much though that we want to force it, but more the biology or like the biological constraints enforce this. So these are steps that we've taken to achieve exactly this, right? Because you can really see in the analysis of chapter 4 also that in a model that doesn't do these contractions, most of the things are just in PMC, as you basically predicted.
Yeah, thank you very much for that answer. I know it's looking a bit like forward. So I understood from your thesis that these constraints that you have been putting is at the moment mostly handcrafted. Would that be fair to say?
What do you mean by handcrafted?
Like means like you basically look at your model and you keep optimizing and constraining it, bringing it actually to the right level that you desire.
I wouldn't say so. I would say that, I mean, so we are specifically not handcrafting these constraints based on mechanisms that we think the brain implements already, but we are taking a look at very basic neuroanatomical data and then, as unbiased as we can, imply this on the network. But we are not going there and say, ooh, premotor cortex should have this many neurons because I want a lot of information here. But rather we run an analysis on a bunch of data sets that give us information about how many cells there are in the brain. And then we just, without looking at this again, put this into the numbers of how many units there are within each region. So I wouldn't call it handcrafted in this regard. Okay. But of course we did, and this biases it, ourselves decide what kind of neuroanatomical data we put in here. But I can say that this is mostly limited by what is there rather than what we specifically wanted.
Would you foresee in the future that such mechanisms can be automated?
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, so for the pieces of data that we are including, we are like semi-automizing this already, right? Like, so if I would change the data set, I can run my script again, and then it will give me, well, hopefully not very different data, but the data again, right? So like, this is also part of what I'm actually working on right now, that we create tools that allow other researchers to just say what regions they want to use, and then these things are fed into the model design automatically.
Many thanks. Would love to give the word back then to the prorector.
Thank you very much. And the opposition will now be continued by Professor Dr. Bernadette Jansma, who is a professor of cognitive neuroscience of language at this university.
Yeah. Dear candidate, first of all, congratulations to you and your supervisor teams. I also very much love that there is this interdisciplinary collaboration of two faculties that are deep, I favor a lot, not to include the medical faculty, of course, by this. Also, what I really admire while reading is this very nice structure of the thesis across the chapters on methods, model, and analyzing. I think that's great, and also like the incorporation of the environment in general in AI is wonderful to do. You refer to that as the ENC program, right? And I would like to basically discuss with you a little bit some of the premises you put in the introduction on that. And on one, for example, is, and I think you cited Varela 91 there, that cognition is embodied action. Well, makes sense also with regard to the content of your program, but I would like to challenge you a bit now. So if I do this, and I start talking to you now, would you now say that I think differently?
Yes, I would say. You will probably, I mean, actually, I think you will also notice this yourself to some degree, but I think that you will perceive the world differently, right? Like, you actually have something in your mouth, and you need to kind of circumvent this fact. You need to still express yourself. Maybe you are thinking about what kind of words can you utter now, or how can you formulate the sentences in a more simple way, so that everyone still understands you, although you're kind of mumbling. So I would say you're thinking differently, right? It's not so much maybe always the consciously perceived thinking that we might regard to, but like I'm also like including all the cognitive parts, right? Like I would even say that perception changes to some regard. But it is of course also about your body slightly changes because you have something in your mouth. But maybe your actual intentions about what you are saying and what you want to achieve with this, how you want to interact with your environment, they might not drastically change, and they are still driving most of your cognitive processes.
Yeah.
Then.
So that was the key noun phrase that you passed on, is that my body changes. So what if I have amputated limbs?
I would say that changes a lot about your cognition as well, because you have, say you have an amputated arm, suddenly the way that you can interact with the world changes. So everything that you think about, how you want to interact with the world, needs to change as well. So this has a strong influence as well.
And would you even go so far that if I would be locked in, that's this locked-in syndrome, where I don't have any sensation to the body anymore, that I still be able to think?
I would say you're still able to think, but again, it will change something about it. But the interesting thing, I think, with locked-in patients is that they still have a body, and they can maybe simulate movements in their mind, right? They can do something like motor imagery, in a sense, and they still have a connection to their body to some end. I mean, I'm not fully like deep into the clinical implications of locked in, but I would still say that they are aware of their body and maybe remember how they interacted before. But I could also, it's of course hard to tell, but I could imagine that this is something that adapts and changes the longer the patient is locked in.
Yeah. So and then you passed on the next nice noun phrase, means this feedback from the body, and that actually brings me to a second statement. I sort of sensed, and you also, I think, in one introduction page, you mentioned that it seems that goal-driven models outperform data-driven models, sort of. Am I correct? I think
Outperform? In what regard?
Yeah, I think it was in the introduction that you seem to prefer goal-driven models.
I mean, it's not what I would like to come over, right? Like, I think both are very important. Like, both goal-driven models and bottom-up models can add a lot of relevant insight to how we understand the brain.
Because I was asking because when you look into animal electrophysiology in terms of feedback connections between neurons and body sensations, and for example also prediction of movement and errors, you see basically neurons in different premotor motor areas that are either more goal-driven sensitive or data-driven sensitive or action-oriented. So question was whether different types of models could be combined, and how would you envision that?
I mean, I think, personally, I would say that any model in the end should be, like the perfect model should be both goal-driven and properly representing the data, like the biology of the brain, right? So in that regard, yes, I would also say that our goal is to combine what we know from both sides, right? There's always this like graph that people like to show where they put biological fidelity on the x-axis and functional fidelity on the y-axis, and then there's like a bunch of models on both of these axes, but we kind of want to come into the middle. And I think for this, both are relevant, and we need to find a way to combine them.
Yeah.
How like it would work that certain neurons are goal-driven and certain are data-driven, I don't really understand the question in this regard.
Yeah, I think in terms of the idea of forward models, they call it mosaic, that you have different types of forward models that are actually standing next to each other, at least in biology, and then some magic decision is made to overrule one and prioritize the other. So I was just wondering whether it would be possible to combine these different aspects into an overall arching.
I think, we can, for instance, combine the very cortical model that we've built now with maybe more biophysical models of subcortical structures or the cerebellum in order to implement, for instance, a forward model.
Nice. And then probably my last point relates to future. So you very nicely incorporates this body-brain interaction by like focusing on the hand. We know from social psychology that I might move my hand differently if I'm alone or with two of the people in a room, or when I'm moving my hands in front of 2,000 people. So I was wondering how would you incorporate social environment in these models?
Very difficult. I would say, so we are definitely not there, right? But we are incorporating the body and the environment to a very limited extent, right? We only have a hand and we only have manipulation of a cube. But I think that in the long run, we can of course extend this. And maybe we can at some point create tasks that afford some sort of multi-agent interaction, where there's also other people in the room, and intentions that are maybe more abstract than the very clear goals that we are setting here, which is turn this cube into a new position, but rather something that they actually want to achieve by interacting with another human. And then they first need to abstract that goal into smaller sub-goals that they're not achieved. Yeah. So I think this way we can...
And would it be possible, because that's like, my thought is inspired by this work of Uri Hasson, where they, for example, have people listening to a story, and then you see that the brains synchronize more when they listen to the same story and actually understand that. So what would happen if you put several models next to each other and you allow them to talk to each other? Would they actually come up with different solutions?
If the models can process what the other models are telling it, there's a lot of steps here, right? Like, first of all, the models have to be able to say something. They actually have to be able to do more than one thing, right? This model can also only manipulate cubes. Beyond that, there's not much function. But yeah, I mean, like as we get closer to what a human can in its general ability to interact with the environment do, the closer we get to such scenarios. I don't think the limitation is in the kind of scenarios and the kind of tasks we can imagine, but much more what the model can actually achieve.
Okay.
Yeah. But this is not, I don't think this is limited by the kind of model, but more how far we are in getting them better at doing these things and maybe training with genes.
Thanks a lot. I fear my time is up. I'll give the word back. Yeah.
Thank you very much. The next opponent joins us online, all the way from Italy. And it will be Dr. Giovanni Pezzulo, who is a research director of cognitive science and technology at the National Research Council of Italy. The word is yours.
So first of all, I would like to congratulate with the candidate and the supervisor, because it's really a remarkable achievement. So that this thesis combines very nicely strong theoretical motivation based upon embodied cognition, and very nice and solid AI solutions, and you already have very interesting results also from a neuroscience perspective, especially about how the brain processes hierarchical plans. So there is a lot in this thesis. So congratulations. And my first question is about the relations with theories of embodied cognition and activism. So you write in your thesis that these theories provided you with a motivation and with some insights. And now my question to you is whether you think that what you did, and in more generally your research program, can also help these theories develop a little bit. So you discussed the implications for neuroscience, but I think there are also interesting implications for theories of embodied cognition, because, for instance, there are some debates about the notion of representation, or the notion about how higher cognitive skills like planning might be grounded into sensorimotor function. Do you think that you can say something to these theories?
Thank you for your compliments and also for your question. Yes, I think this can go both ways very much, right? Like, just like already, I think the movement of embodied and active cognition has generally influenced neuroscience to look at different things, and that has then fed back into these theories, kind of evidences this. And I think also with the modeling approach, we can do the same, right? By analysis, for instance, of if we change the task, if we make it more ecologically valid, if we involve more of the body, or if we focus on more abstract information extraction tasks, if we put them against each other and see which models actually learn the better representations, the representations that are more close to what we find in the brain, then this can tell us something about how much action there should be in the representations, right? Like, imagine, for instance, we we build two models of the visual system. One that is only solving classifications of images, and another one that actually helps, for instance, this model to manipulate the cube. And if we then are comparing the two, and we can actually see that the one that does the motor action, that has intentions beyond extraction of information, if that one has the more plausible representations, that tells us a lot about the importance of these goals.
Thanks. So a very quick follow-up to this question is the following. So in embodied cognition, one important concept is that action is important also for sensing, so active sensing, active learning. In your thesis, you have explored what happens at the end of the training, like what are the representation, what are the mechanisms that emerge. But do you think that it would be also possible to use your models to study things like active sensing and active learning during the process?
In the current framework, I would say that's going to be a bit difficult, because the kind of learning that we are using is not biologically plausible at all, right? We are only aiming at plausible inference, but not at plausible learning. Also because the beginning of the model will be a very unplausible one itself already, right? It's starting at completely random connectivity. The model doesn't even know what a hand is, that it has control over it or anything, right? It's really about, from the beginning, without any knowledge, exploring and interacting with the environment to understand all of these pieces. So really having like a developmental schedule or one that is going through multiple stages of learning a new skill will be difficult with the setup we have currently. But I could imagine, for instance, training a model on a complex function like any motor interaction with the hand with our approach, and then going a step further, take this model and use a new kind of learning on it that is compatible with the kind of model, and there go then into these questions about learning.
Okay, probably a quick comment on that is that also at the end of the training, do you think you can analyze whether the sensing strategies are active, in the sense that maybe the hand is exploring, providing there is some uncertainty in the model or in the cube orientation, maybe it's using some active sensing to reduce this uncertainty?
Definitely something we can analyze here. And like indeed, right, like relating to active sensing, this can be quite interesting already, and doesn't need what I've just said, right? We can do this in this model right now. Actually, we haven't done this, so I can't say anything about whether our model does this. But the work that we've taken the task from OpenAI, they have trained this like 1-2 layer model on a setting where they are constantly changing the physical parameters of the world that the hand is situated in order to make it more robust to the actual real-world application. And there you can see that in the first few seconds of the behavior, it does some kind of behavior that tries to figure out what kind of parameters it has in order to then deal with them. So in a sense, you can see that already here.
Yeah, I agree. So my very last question is the following. So as you know very well, now in AI, there is a big trend towards building very big foundation models that are based upon, well, many different things, but at least two things that are a bit different from the way you did your model. One is training on many different tasks, as opposed to as training on just one task, which is manipulating the object. And the second is using a self-supervised objective, as opposed to reinforcement learning. So do you think that there are pros and cons in your approach and this foundation approach, or some parts can be combined, like whether it will be important to train on different things rather than just one task? What do you think about that?
I think that's definitely possible. So I think the first part of this will be that parts of the model can always be pre-trained or just using a foundation model that is pre-trained on a different task, right? Although we, for instance, discussed that the motor aspects might be very important even in the visual cortex, we can always take a foundation model that does visual tasks across many different task settings and use that as a component that we are plugging into the larger model, right? The nice thing about these deep neural networks is also that you can kind of plug them into each other as long as you can assure that the output of one makes sense to the input of the other. And then we can also we can not freeze the weights, so to say, of these models, but still let them learn and thus maybe more incorporate also the influence of motor and embodiment. At the same time, I also think that we can still do this kind of multitask training that you've referred to with reinforcement learning. It will be much more complex and require a very big supercomputer cluster. But I think that this is still possible. And I think the ultimate goal should actually be that we have these kind of foundation models, say for instance for dexterity, where we have a model that already can do basic motor things with its hand, and then we give it a cube and it only now has to learn how to manipulate the cube, but not how to move its fingers anymore. This should be the goal down the road.
Thanks a lot. So I give word back to the prorector.
Thank you very much. Are you ready for your last opponent? And I give the word to the concluding opponent, which is Professor Dr. David Linden, a professor of translational neuroscience at Maastricht University.
Dear candidate, also my congratulations to you and your promotion team for this very interesting work and the nice presentation. I would like to focus on neuropsychological aspects and implications of your work. On page 1 and 2, and also in your presentation, you describe the 3 variants of the model: a base model, a capacity model, and the full model. Which one would you say, if any, most closely reflects the functionality of the healthy adult human brain?
Highly esteemed opponent, thank you for your compliments and your question. I wouldn't say that any of these models particularly reflect more the healthy brain. I would say there are more multiple stages of us adding more and more biological plausibility to the model. So in this regard, all of them are kind of unhealthy because they're definitely not a reflection of the full brain yet. But I would not say that certain previous stages would be comparable to some clinical issue.
Is the full model then the one that most closely approximates what's likely to happen?
Yeah.
Yes, okay, very clear. But would you say that these 3 stages are reflected or have a correspondence in any empirical changes in the brain architecture, brain functioning, like different developmental stages, sort of maturing human brain or lesions, or is it mainly a sort of computational complexity that you're adding, not really reflecting actual stages of brain development in nature?
Yeah, I would say it's not reflecting actual developments. But caveat, I'm not an expert in developmental neuroscience, right? So, but like I would still say that. So our aim, for sure, was not to reflect this in them, but rather our aim was to kind of isolate certain steps we've taken in adding more biological plausibility. So with every step,
Now, on what sort of I find very interesting as a neuropsychiatrist is the modularity of your model, if that's the right word. For example, on page 104, you have these different subcomponents of the brain, of the frontal cortex and the parietal cortex, for example, inspired by imaging and inspired by cell density. Mm-hmm. Would it be possible to use this or adapt this model to model lesions? Take out one component as you find empirically in a stroke or another brain lesion and see how it performs then on something like the dexterity task.
Yes, definitely. I think here we can find the clinical implications, so to say. I really like to say this whenever someone asks me, but what are the clinical implications of your work? That down the road, if we actually get better and better performing models and more plausibility into the network, we can indeed just try to turn off one region, or we are turning off certain neurons, or a bunch of randomly in a region, and see how that affects the behavior. In a sense, we've already done this in chapter 4, where we had turned off certain principal components from the representation of regions, but then still let the network perform. And so we can simulate lesions, but we can also simulate what happens after certain changes, or maybe medications applied, that, or like how surgery would affect the brain. Of course not in this model, right, disclaimer, but because it's not far enough, I would say, in its plausibility. But as we improve this and maybe also work together with clinicians to see what should be in the model, we could move towards this.
So this type of model architecture has the capacity to implement virtual lesions, and to a certain extent you've already done that.
You can remove certain parts of the model and see what happens.
Could you also try and model a clinical picture? Like, you're referring yourself to externally cued and internal motor programs. Now that is very commonly observed in frontal lobe lesions, in neurodegenerative disorders, that patients are affected in their capacity of carrying through with internal motor programs. They're very dependent on external cueing. Is that a functionality that you can model?
I would say we can model the lesion and then see what the effect is of.
You may still finish your answer.
Okay. We can see what the effect is, but I'm not sure what you referred to with like medical images or something, whether we can see them in there. But I think a lot of like we cannot really currently look at a representation and say how that would look in the brain, because there's, for instance, zero spatial relationships between the neurons, right? So they are more like one big blob. So before we have more anatomy also in this regard there, it's going to be difficult to go down that road.
You've answered my question very clearly. Thank you.
Tonio Weidler, the time appointed for defending your thesis has passed. The decree committee will now withdraw to discuss the quality of your thesis and your defense. I request you and your company await the results of our deliberations and our return in this room.
Please all rise.
The PhD defense has now ended. The degree committee will debate the candidate's performance behind closed doors. This process usually takes about 10 minutes.
Long road to the south side. 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. I know you know that I can't read your mind. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. On the dash, got my laces tied. Long road, I don't waste no time. Break rules because fate decides. With the team and we chase the light. I make a move, fall down, shake it off. I hate to lose, bad branch, break it off. No room for negativity, praise and love. Prepare for deep part cause we're taking off. Take the mileage, traveling so far from home. Gathering knowledge, other connections. I put the time in to get everything I ever hoped for. It's a challenge and we all in. It's a better future that we go for. And even though these nights seem long, I know that I am never on my own. Know you won the battle once you grow. South side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Long road to the south side, 10 miles in my rearview mirror, I know what it felt like. My goal's only getting clearer, east side to the west side. No place like home, if it's questions that you've got, go the extra mile and die. Years can't fly by now, don't waste all your time. Cause I'll go the extra mile.
Yes, Tonio Weidler. The degree committee here present has assessed the quality of your thesis and your defense. In view of its positive verdict and taking into account your previous qualifications, the degree committee has decided to grant you the degree of doctor. Professor Goebel is authorized to confer upon you this academic distinction in accordance with Dutch university custom. I invite your supervisor to now take the floor.
Promise to work in accordance with the principles of scientific integrity at all times, to be careful and honest, transparent, independent, and responsible.
Yes, I promise.
By the authority vested in us by law and in conformity with the decision of the committee here present, I hereby confer upon you, Tonio Weidler, the degree of doctor, and grant you all rights attached by custom and law. As evidence of this, I now present you with the degree certificate signed by the rector, the secretary, and the other members of the committee, and affixed with the official seal of the university. Dr. Weidler, the honor to give the Laudatio will be your daily supervisor, Mario, but I want to also say how proud I am to see you here with this brilliant performance today, as I'm used to from you. And I also want to extend this to your family and friends. This was really a pleasure to listen to you today. And I also want to thank you as a former member of the scientific board of the Human Brain Project, because your project was one of only 6 showcases, 6 strong highlights of the Human Brain Project. And also there, it was always good if I could refer to your work to make the next step, to get the next money, and so on. So thank you very much. But now the pleasure is to give the word to Mario.
Thank you very much, Rainer. Dear colleagues, friends and family of Tonio, of course, you yourself as well. Today, we celebrate the successful PhD defense of Tonio. I first met him as one of the students in a master project on integrating neural principles into deep learning, which I co-supervised also with Kurt. Kurt, of course, also remained a very important presence and mentor throughout your career. And I think this is in part because even then we could see what a very talented researcher you are. You were very driven, determined, and always giving at least 110%. Little did we know at that time, but this project was actually the beginning of your transition towards becoming a neuroscientist. So I'm sorry you couldn't get rid of me anymore after that. And slowly, starting from your master project and your thesis towards the PhD, you became a neuroscientist, not without a detour, because actually you had to become a software engineer first. So, Tonio's enacted approach to neuroscience, the enacted neuroconnectionist paradigm, is so cutting edge that actually not a single tool existed to do this kind of research. So very naturally, you built one yourself, right? Angora Pi. And using this tool, you were then really able to build this very impressive model, right? That is very brain-inspired, embodied, and was able to teach us new insights about dexterity. Rainer already alluded to this, but through this work, he also basically single-handedly made Showcase 5 a huge success. It is really difficult to overstate the impressiveness of this achievement. especially considering that the other showcases had 20 people or more working on them, and Tonio basically just pulled this off all by himself. So that's incredibly impressive. But he handled this challenge masterfully and demonstrated his exceptional skills and unwavering commitment. Beyond his academic prowess, Tonio is also a remarkable individual with a multitude of talents and interests. So I have witnessed him to be really an artisan, right? Baking his own bread and his own pizza. He has very deep knowledge and interest in coffee. And I'm actually already surprised that you're not roasting your own beans yet. Though maybe sometimes it's also good to leave some things to the professionals. I know you at some point started to maintain your own bicycle. Yeah, right? I think you told me something like that, and then 2 accidents on slippery roads kind of convinced you that maybe professional repair shops are there for a reason. But nevertheless, apart from this, you also play padel, you used to boulder, and I really don't know how you balance all these hobbies alongside your demanding work with this level of enthusiasm. Honestly, I cannot understand it. I cannot tell how do you do this. And maybe someone can do a PhD to address this particular question. But okay, here I am, rambling about crazy ideas. Tonio can tell a story about that. So Tonio, your dedication, innovative spirit, and unwavering perseverance have been truly inspiring to me, and I think to all of your supervisors. We are all exceptionally proud of you, and as you now prepare to embark on the next stage of your career, I know that Victor in Marseille is crossing his fingers. I know that we are here also crossing our fingers, that you hopefully stay with us. I have no doubt that you will continue to push boundaries. So congratulations, Dr. Tonio Weidler. May your future endeavors be as rewarding and impactful as your time here has been so far. Congratulations also one more time to your family and friends.
Yes, Dr. Weidler, also on behalf of Maastricht University, congratulations to this great achievement, wonderful PhD thesis and defense, and also indeed congratulations to your family. I hope you enjoyed the ceremony and are very proud of Tonio. And with this, I would like to formally close this academic session. So now we can all relax a little bit, the informal part can start. But a few words to explain how this will happen. We still have some work to do, so the committee and you, and maybe also closest family, stay a little bit in this room for some picture taking. And I also would like to ask our Corona member from Italy who joins us online to stay a bit online for a few more minutes to be part of the picture. And of course, having said that, I want to thank the entire Corona, all the opponents for a great defense, especially the guests from extern, like our colleague from Italy, but also